4. Let's stand as we sing together.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil He doth richly repay. Not a grief or a loss, not a frown or a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at His feet, or we'll walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you all. Appreciate it. Appreciate you being here. Glad you're here tonight. I tell you, I hate it that the weather's messy and outside, because this is really important stuff tonight. We're going to finish up the Ten Commandments tonight. Remember last week we talked about the commandments being divided into two sections. The first 4 having to do with our relationship to God, our love for God. So each one of those commandments have to do with that. And the last 6 have to do with our relationship with others. Remembering that when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He actually said 2. Remember, love God with all that you have. Love your neighbor as yourself. Relationship to God, relationship to each other. This is so important. I've shared with some of you, I think this was in traditional service, so I won't belabor this, but a few years ago I had a little minor surgery, and I told you I'd gone in to see the doctor, and we were talking and visiting, and I'll never forget this. You know, he told me, you know, it's kind of like, hey, he referred to it as the blue plate special. He said, well, I'm going to give you the blue plate special. You know, we're going to do that. We're going to take, blood work. We're going to do that. Then there's going to be a scope, and then there's going to be something else. I can't remember what it was. He said, that's our blue plate special. And he knew I was a preacher because we had talked about that before in other visits. And he said, does the church have a blue plate special? Does Christianity, do we have a, he said, and he's Christian, and he said, do we have a blue plate special? And man, I was ready for him. I'm not ready all the time, but I was ready for this one. I said, yes, we do. We actually do. We have a blue plate special. And this is it. I said, and I told him, I said, I remember a guy came to Jesus one day. He said, just get down to it for me. Just boil it all down. What does it come down to? What is it that I've got to do to inherit eternal life? Remember? And here was the deal. Love God with everything you have, heart, soul, strength, mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I remember him looking at me, and he said, man, yeah, that's right. He said, that is. He said, that's our blue plate special, isn't it? I said, that's the blue plate special. That's the deal. He said, gosh, if we just do that. He said, now the loving God part, he said, you know, that's not so difficult, the loving God. But the loving neighbor, he said, well, we really have a hard time with that, don't we? And I've been thinking a lot about that. I think that's the way a lot of folks think, is that the loving God, hey, we don't have any trouble with that, right? The loving God, it's the loving each other. It's the loving the neighbor. But here's what's interesting about that. When you go back scripturally and you look at this, you see that those two are so intertwined that the way that we love God is loving each other. And when we love each other, we're really loving God. And when there's a brokenness in our relationship with each other, there's a brokenness in our relationship with God. We see those as two separate. I have begun to wonder if that's the reason why Jesus said, the first is this and the second is like unto it. And I've begun to wonder if the reason Jesus said it that way is because they are so intertwined and intermingled that they are really one. Remember the guy asked him, what is the greatest commandment? He just asked him, what's the greatest commandment? The one commandment. And Jesus said, here, love God. The second, the guy didn't ask for two, he just asked for one. Jesus said the second is like unto it. And I've begun to wonder, did he mean by that those two are so intertwined that they are actually one, that you can't have one without the other? You cannot love God, really love God, without loving each other. And if we don't love each other, we're really not loving God. Well, in thinking about that, I thought, what do the scriptures say about that? So before we, this is why these last 6 are so important tonight. I want you to turn to 1 John. Turn to 1 John before we head to Exodus. The 3rd chapter of 1 John. And if you're having trouble finding it, just go to Revelation and go backwards. It's real easy if you'll do it that way. You know, Revelation's at the end, then go backwards, and there you go. Okay, 1 John, the 3rd chapter. I'm going to read some selected verses, so I'll call your attention. Go to the 3rd chapter and skip down to the 16th verse. Okay? By this we know love. This is how we know love. That he's talking about Jesus, laid down his life for us. That's how we know love. We know that he loved us because, well, look what he did. He gave his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for others. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. So what's he saying? Love is not just words. Love is action. So it's real easy to tell someone, hey, I love you. But if there's not the actions there to hold that up, then the words are empty. Skip to verse 23. Still in the 3rd chapter, verse 23. And this is his commandment, talking about Jesus. This is Jesus' commandment to us, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. How? Just as he has commanded us. You remember in John's gospel, Jesus said, love one another as I've loved you. That we should love one another just as he has commanded us. All who keep his commandments abide in him, and he in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit which he has given to us. Now skip to the 7th verse of the 4th chapter. We're still talking about love. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and he who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God. Isn't that interesting? how this is, you see where this is connected up? So you can say, well, I love God, but if I'm not loving others, what John is saying, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Now, we could spend another 5 weeks talking about what does it mean to love. Okay? That's a whole other topic. Be a great topic for Sunday school classes. So what does it mean to love? And you can go back scripturally and look at some of those things. But look at what he's saying here is, he who loves is born of God and knows God, but he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the expiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. Then the final part of this passage, skip to verse 19 of chapter 4. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother, and he's not talking about sibling. This is brother, sister, neighbor, the fellow human being, okay? He who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. Gee whiz, this is powerful stuff. This Sunday school stuff right here. You just mark this stuff down and use this in Sunday school lessons and just chew on it, chew on it, chew on it about what does this mean. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God should love his brother also. So you see what's going on then. We got these 10 commandments. First 10 have to do with our relationship with God. Now when we come to the relationship with others, you see why this is so important. Because what John is reminding us of is, if there's a brokenness in our relationship with each other, it's not just a brokenness in our relationship with each other, it's a brokenness in our relationship with God, because the two are so intertwined, they are so connected. I was pastoring a church several years ago, and there was a guy in that church, and he talked about loving Jesus all the time. Love Jesus. Love Jesus. Nothing wrong with that, is there? Love Jesus. Love Jesus. It was kind of an interesting thing. He used to measure the quality. I'm not making this up. He used to measure the quality of sermon based upon how many times the preacher said Jesus. I remember I preached a sermon one Sunday. It was all on Jesus. I don't remember what the scripture was. But I only said Jesus 3 times in the sermon. The following Sunday, I was out of town. One of the associates preached, and he said Jesus 26 times. And when I came back, this guy brought that to staff parish committee as a complaint against me, because the associate over here said Jesus 26 times. That's a sermon. Now that's a sermon. But Cliff only said Jesus 3 times. 3 times. Jesus, Jesus, he said all that is. We got to say Jesus, we got to say Jesus, we got to love Jesus, we got to love Jesus. Not long after that, I got an email from someone who had no idea that this had gone on. I mean, they had no idea that this had gone on. It was another person, member of the church, who was letting me know that they were going to leave the church. And they said, I want to tell you why. They said, I feel like I owe this to you. She said, I kind of hate it. She said, it's not because of you. And then she went on, and this doesn't matter, but she said, love your sermons. Love your sermons. I'm going to miss that. I'm going to miss the music in the church. But she said, there's a guy in the church. And she told me his name, and it was this guy. And she said, he's always talking about God and Jesus and God and Jesus. But I've watched how he treats other people. And he's so mean to other people. And I can't stomach that. So I'm leaving. Now, I'm not saying that was right either. But do you see the power of our witness? In my 36 years of ministry, I've had people talk to me oftentimes about leaving the church. And you know what's interesting? When people get upset with the church, and this has just been my experience, but I don't think I'm alone in this. I think there are a multitude of ministers that could say this, and lay people like you as well. But the reason, there are people who have differences of opinion on music and tastes in music and styles of music and styles of worship. There are people who have differences of opinion and all numerous kinds of things going on in the church. But people, for the most part, they don't leave the church over a song or music or a sermon they've heard or a lesson they've heard. You know what they leave over? At least this has been my experience. I've had people that said, look, I cannot stomach anymore people saying Jesus and living completely opposite from Jesus. Just can't handle it anymore. Just can't handle it anymore. That hypocrisy of saying that we love Jesus and then the way we treat other people. Do you see why this is so important tonight? Do you see? We can say we love God. Hey, I love God. Boy, I love God. We say, I've given my life to Jesus. Now, you may be saying tonight, wait a minute, Cliff, it's just a couple of weeks, Sunday before last, your whole sermon was on grace. This takes nothing away from grace. That's why we need grace. Every single one of us is going to fall. Every single one of us is going to fail. Fail, over and over and over and over. That's great. That's great. God doesn't stop loving us. He doesn't stop coming after us. He doesn't stop accepting us. Okay? Or it's not grace. But when we accept the grace, then what we want to, God has given us these commandments to show us that this is how you witness to other people, but it's also how we get life. It's the way, it's the way you have life, the way you want to have life. You love God. You love those that are around you. And our relationship with those that are around us are so important. Okay? With me so far? Turn to the Ten Commandments then. So this is important stuff. This stuff about relationship with each other. And guess what? It starts in our family. It starts in our very own families. And I don't think this is by accident. So we've got the first 4 that have to do with our relationship with God. The next 6 have to do with a relationship with each other. And the very first one right out of the box has to do with family. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. This is where it begins. It begins with that foundation of relationship and family. We could spend a lot of time talking about this one, but it has to do with loving a mother and father, honoring mother and father. One of the things that I started thinking about is then that means there's an expectation on us as mothers and fathers to live lives that are worthy of being honored. Are you with me? Honor your mother and father. So then there's that, well, wait a minute. So I need to live a life that is worthy of that. I was in a church in Mississippi several years ago, and I was invited, didn't have to be invited, but I was invited to come to the youth program one night. I had a huge youth program in that church. I went, and they were actually doing a series on the Ten Commandments, and they had gotten to this one: honor your father and your mother. And when it was over that night, I had this. I'll never forget this. I had this young teenage girl come up to me, and there was a counselor with her, and they said, Pastor Cliff, she's got a question she wants to ask you, and they said she's kind of troubled about some things, and she was wondering if she could ask you something. I said, absolutely. You can ask me. You want now? You want to come by and see me? She said, no, I'm okay with talking to you now. Then I won't get into all the details, but this is what she said. Here was the problem. Her father had abused her. Her father had abused her. And she said, tonight we talked about honoring mother and father. And she said, my father's no longer around, but my mother is. But my mother knew about it. My father did it. My mother knew. And the Bible says, honor your mother and father. She said, Pastor Cliff, am I supposed to honor my mother and father? A teenager asked me that. Teenager asked me that question. Whew. That gets a little rough, doesn't it? Gets a little rough. Do you see the importance of living then so that there's a worthiness of being? Now you have to be careful with that. Oh, I've got to earn everything. All the perfect mothers and fathers stand up. Whew, let me sit down real fast. No, that's not what's being talked about. But that, so what I was reminded of is Ephesians. Can you turn to Ephesians real quick? This is another great section. Ephesians, the 6th chapter. Actually, the end of the 5th chapter, going into the 6th chapter. This is a passage that's, abused, misunderstood, misinterpreted. And it's really kind of shameful. Because what happens is people forget, it's in a section and people forget the first sentence of the section. Because the first sentence of the section tells us what the whole passage is about. And it's about loving others, relationship with others in the family. And this is the way it begins. Verse 21. Chapter 5 of Ephesians, verse 21. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's the first sentence in this section where Paul's writing to the people in the church at Ephesus on the importance of our relationship in the family. And the very first sentence, which is the key, because it's saying what everything else is about, and he says this, be subject to one another. Be subject to one another. And do that. Why do we do that? Why in the family are we subject to one another? It's because of our love for Christ. It's out of our reverence for Christ, being servants of Christ, we are subject to each other. What does that mean to be subject to each other? Well, here's what's interesting. He starts to explain that. Being subject, because everybody is subject. Everybody in the family is subject to each other. What does that mean, being subject to each other? Does that mean that only women are subject to the men? Be subject to one another? What does being subject to one another mean? Hey, y'all know the answer to this. What does it mean? To be subject to one another means what? Alice said it. What? Everybody. Everybody is subject to each other. And so it's really interesting in this section that's exactly what Paul says. Listen to it. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now he talks about the wives. He talks about the wives first. He says, wives, be subject to your husbands. Be subject to one another. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as to the Lord. Then he says this. He says, the husband is the head of the wife. And what I've discovered is so many men, in particular husbands, they like to put a period right there. They like to put a period there and strike through the rest or white it out. It's what a lot of men I know do. I've even heard preachers do that. Wives, be subject to your husbands as the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife. Boom, period. End of sentence. Leave everything else out. But Paul didn't do that. Paul didn't say that. Paul said the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and as himself its Savior, as Christ is the head of the church. Now then, here's where you got to do some Bible study. And you're thinking, how in the world are we going to get through all these 10 commandments tonight? It's already 6:30. Okay. How was Christ the head of the church? How was Christ the head? By becoming a what? Christ was the head by becoming a what? By becoming a servant. Christ was the head by becoming a servant. Scripture's really clear about that. Now, if you've forgotten that, go to Philippians, and since I want to get us out, you just go read Philippians yourself. But what it talks about is Jesus coming down the ladder. You know, we spend our life working our way up the ladder, don't we? If I could just work my way up the ladder. You know what Jesus did? And you go back and read Philippians, it said Jesus was born equal to God. That's what Paul says in his letter to Philippians. He was born equal to God. But then it says, then he started coming down the ladder. He was born equal to God. But then here's what he did. He took on the form of a servant. And not just any servant, remember? He went to the cross and he died. I mean, he took the servanthood as far as you can take it, and he just kept coming down the ladder. So when Paul says the husband is the head, it's the head the way Jesus was the head. How was Jesus the head, husbands? Well, by being a servant. I'll bet you there's a lot of wives that are marking that passage right now. But then he says, verse 20, let's move on. Then he says, verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for us. That's how we love. Being subject to. How do you be subject to your wives? Husbands, so he said, wives, be subject to your husband. Now he says, husbands, hey, you're not left out of this because it's be subject to one another. Husbands, you be subject to your wives. And how do you be subject to your wives? You love her as Christ loved the church. How much did Christ love the church? Well, where did he go? All the way to the cross. That's how you're subject. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Skip down to chapter 6. So you got husbands and wives. Then you got children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. There's our commandment, right? So children are doing what? Being subject to their parents. So children, obey, honor. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. But then he doesn't leave the parents out. Look at what he says. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Isn't that interesting? I just find it incredibly fascinating. Because what Paul said, and it all goes back to that first verse, that first sentence. What was it? In the family, you are subject to one another, you love one another. And it all starts, it's interesting to me, it's that family is foundational. It starts in the family, and then it branches out from there. So it's just interesting to me that the first commandment that has to do with our relationship with each other comes back to honor your father and your mother. But fathers and mothers, you've got a responsibility. Raise your children up. Raise your children up this way. Raise your children up in obedience. There's a responsibility there so that you are able to be honored by them. Verse 13, you shall not kill. So here's the second one. Don't kill. I would say that most of us, if you're like me, you would say, okay, you don't need to talk about that one. Okay, got that one down. Don't kill. But here's what's interesting. Have you ever known someone that, there's no way that they would even think about hitting someone, much less killing someone. Okay? They wouldn't even think about striking another person, much less killing someone. But they don't think twice about saying something about someone that could ruin their reputation, and in ruining their reputation becomes a part of killing them. Does that make sense? So this killing thing, again, it has to do with the importance of our relationship to each other. I've got several books in my library on the Ten Commandments. This one is kind of a simple one, but the author's really got some neat things. And by the way, you may have used this before. This is, if you want to kind of maybe dig a little bit further into some discussion with Sunday school class, this is a good one to use in a Sunday school class. It's called The Ten Commandments from the Backside, and it's written by J. Ellsworth Callis, who was a great Methodist preacher. And he had something to say about this whole deal about this not killing, and how, it goes beyond what we normally think, perhaps. And this was one of the examples he had used. He just talked about how, is the harsh word a close cousin to murder? Certainly not in the obvious way. Most of us are too civilized for that. But what about the pain we bring to another person? Does this pain exhibit some elements of death? And this was the example he gave. He said, consider, for instance, two of America's presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson. We know that Abraham Lincoln was killed by an assassin's bullet. But what about Wilson? Herbert Hoover, who knew a good bit from his own experience about the pain of vilification, wrote a book entitled The Ordeal. I didn't know this historically. Maybe you did, but I didn't. But Herbert Hoover wrote this book entitled The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was perhaps as idealistic a person as has ever served in the White House. He had a dream for world peace. Many national leaders disagreed with him. Many disagreed with him, as they had every right to do. But some didn't just disagree. Some of the opponents became vile, hateful, and vindictive, as is frequently the case in the world, he says, of politics. Well, it's just frequently the case in the world, right? It's just frequently the case. They weren't satisfied to fight Wilson's ideas. They set out to destroy the man, and they succeeded. He finished his term of office a completely shattered man. Perhaps Wilson was assassinated as surely as was Lincoln. It was a longer process, and more executioners pulled the trigger, but the result was the same. The result was the same. But on the other hand, here's the other part of that, though. The other side of that coin is how we can also then be life-giving. So we can be contributors to taking away life, but we can also be life-giving. And one of the ways that we can be life-giving is how? Well, there's that word again, love. What does it mean? That's Sunday school lesson. Y'all could just take that and chew on that. What does it mean to love? What does it mean to love? But have you ever been down lower in a snake's belly, and right at that time you got a note or you got an email or somebody gave you a call or somebody said something about you and picked you up? That's life-giving. And I think it adds life, maybe years, to people's lives of how we can do that in the community. Love God. So you can say you love God. Hey, I love God. But if we're treating others in a way that is unloving, John in his first letter said, then you don't love God. It's pretty tough what John says in his first letter. What he says is, you don't love each other. So look, I'm going to tell you, say what you want to, but you don't love God. You don't love each other. You don't love God. So you got to get your relationships with each other. You got to get that straightened out. Don't kill. You shall not commit adultery. Some of the hardest, if not the hardest, counseling I've done as a pastor. In my counseling, I tell people, hey, look, I'm not a counselor because I'm not a licensed counselor, but I can listen. But some of the hardest times I have had as a pastor with other people is seeing a person, husband or wife, come into my office. And in some cases, it's been both who have come in together, and they're dealing with the pain of adultery, dealing with that pain. that brokenness in that relationship, that brokenness of that commitment, that brokenness in the trust that two people have for each other. And so you see where, again, this all holds together, where you've got love of God, you love God, and you're loving each other. But if there's brokenness in those relationships, so when you have given your life to someone and then you have broken that, think about that, you've broken the trust that is with the person that you have said, I give you my trust, I give you my life, I give you my commitment, which is what we do at marriage. I'm giving myself away to you. When that trust is broken through the pain of adultery, how can you ever trust that person for anything else? You see, because it breaks everything else. Now, I've watched grace work though. I can close my eyes and see this couple. And they came into my office, and this guy was broke. He was one of the most successful men I've ever been around. He came into my office just broken, weeping. And this guy was like one of these, like a man's man, and he was broken. He said, I have made the biggest mistake of my life. And he went on then to tell me what he had done in this adulterous relationship. I'm going to tell you, and my wife's not here tonight. She's in Memphis with her work. But if I did that, I don't think Amy would do what this guy's wife did. If I did that, I'd be lucky if she followed verse 13, you shall not kill. I would be lucky. But I watch grace work in this. And this is not to say that this is the way that it should always work, but they stay together and they work that out. And this woman, I'm going to tell you, I don't know. An angel, I don't know. She hung in there. Now, she called him to accountability, and they went through counseling and tons of counseling. And but I watched that come back together. But I also saw that tremendous hurt. I've seen many more cases where it doesn't work out that way. You know why? Because trust has been broken. A vow of commitment has been broken. This is so serious here, such serious stuff. We in our society today, let me get on my soapbox and we'll move on. We in our society today, we have made light of this commandment. We live in a culture today that has made light of this commandment. I was in another church. You're going to think, man, you got a lot of stories about church. I might write a book someday. I was in another church. And I had a popular staff member. I mean, popular. Been in this church for years and years and years and was popular with a large audience. Okay? And he committed adultery. And he had an affair. And so Staff Parish was dealing with this. What do we do? How do we deal with it? I'll never forget this. There was a man on the committee, a member of Staff Parish. We've been talking about it for 30 minutes, trying to hold accountable. We felt like we had a responsibility to hold accountable. We also had a family that we were dealing with. It was not just the church, it was a family, but there was also a calling to ministry that we had to deal with. And had that, had there been a brokenness in the trust of that, we talked about it. What do we do? I'll never forget this guy. Finally, after a while, he said, "Hey, look, he just had an affair." I'll never forget it. He just had an affair. He just had an affair. Everybody, he said, everybody have affairs all the time. He said, I think we ought to give him some time off, a little vacation time, and let him get over it, and then we'll bring him back. That's what he said. That's what he said. That's not what we did. You shall not commit adultery. Because, it's in the trust with each other that we have. Is there grace? Absolutely, there's grace. But there's also accountability. There's grace and accountability. There's grace and there's responsibility. There's forgiveness. Yeah. But accountability for actions. Forgiveness and responsibility. I preached a sermon on that in Lubbock, Texas. Forgiveness versus responsibility. I preached that sermon the week that it came out in the news about President Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. The editor of the religion editor of the newspaper called me up and said, I've heard your sermon. I'd like a quote. I'd like to do a story in the newspaper about it. Holy moly. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Look, see how this is dealing with relationships? You shall not steal. You know, it's about relationships being important. When we steal from someone, we've broken the trust with God because we're not trusting enough in God that God is going to provide enough for us. When we steal, we break a trust that we have with other people. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Oh, gee whiz. See, we're kind of back to that killing thing. You shall not bear false witness. Because you see what's happening with the bearing of the false witness. Hey, by the way, what's involved with bearing false witness? You got to have what? You got to have two things in bearing false witness. What have you got to do? What have you got to have? In bearing false witness, what have you got to have? You got to have somebody that's doing what? You got to have somebody that's saying something that is false. Innuendo, something they've heard. Have you ever done that? This is one of those. This is one that's pretty tough. Have you ever said this? Have you ever said you're with some folks and you say, "Listen, I don't know if this is true or not." But, have you ever done that? I'll bet you have. Haven't you? I have. This is serious stuff. I don't know whether this is true or not. It's kind of like bless your heart, you know? When you say bless your heart, that means you can say anything. Bless her heart. And you can just say whatever you want to. I don't know whether this is true or not. I'm not saying, listen, see, it's kind of like it takes me off the hook. I'm not saying this is true. I don't know whether it's true. But let me tell you what I've heard. See, you're leaning in right now, just waiting to hear, aren't you? I want to tell you what I've heard. I heard that, you see, and you got to have a somebody. So it takes somebody that's saying that. May not be true. Gossip, slander. This is serious stuff. But what else do you have to have? What's that, Alice? Oh, you got to have somebody to hear it. You got to have somebody that's willing to hear it. Have you ever stopped somebody when they said, I don't know whether this is true? And you said, well, then I don't need to hear that. I don't need to hear that. My mother-in-law, I've heard her do that. I've heard her do that. I've heard her do that in a crowd of people. Somebody would say, listen, I don't know whether this is true. And she said, then I don't need to hear that. We need to just stop. Don't need to hear that. I mentioned J. Ellsworth Callis. He told this story. He said, when I was a young pastor, I was privileged to have in my congregation a dedicated public official. He was working doggedly at a difficult job. For some reason, the local newspaper began to attack him. And then he began receiving hate mail. He wasn't the kind of man who could endure lies and unfair accusations. You know, just stuff that's not true. Just stuff that people just want to say. He said he wasn't the kind of person that could do that. One day he took a gun and killed himself. Slander did it. Sometimes a person feels utterly helpless and frustrated in responding to false witness. No matter how hard you try, you know you cannot answer all the lies, nor can you correct all the misconceptions. You can't, I can't, nobody can. If somebody is out to do that, you just simply can't do it. You just simply can't do it. And that's why. And it's a brokenness in relationship. And here's what happens. You know what did John say about that? John said, you can say all day long that you love God, but if you're a part of that, you just don't love God. Okay? Because you can't separate those. Those two are intertwined. Those two are together. They are the same thing. Loving God, loving each other, they are so intertwined that they are the same things. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, maidservant, ox, ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. Why? Because it's a brokenness in relationship. You know, when you do that, when you covet what somebody else. Now, notice he didn't say you don't have any ambition that you want. What he says, that you want a wife, or that you want a maidservant, or that you want an ox, or that you want an ass, or that you want a new car, or that you want a new house, or that you want a new suit of clothes, or that you... He doesn't say that. What does he say? But you can't have somebody else's. You can't covet. When you covet somebody else's, there becomes, what happens is they become objects to you. It breaks that relationship. Here's the other thing that it does, is when we covet what somebody else has, it hinders us from realizing all that we have. This is the danger of coveting. When we do that, look, it takes our eyes off of all that we have. It's the sin of comparing. Have you ever noticed, have there ever been a time in your life when you were just perfectly happy and perfectly fine until all of a sudden you found out what somebody else did? You were just happy as you could be. And then you found out, I've had in another church, I've had this happen. I had a staff member, I'm going to tell you, they were as happy as they could be. They were just as happy as they could be. And one day, they found out what another staff member's salary was. And they found out that person's salary was higher than theirs. And they were miserable. Miserable. Isn't that amazing? Coveting. What happens? Brokenness in relationship. Brokenness in relationship. It's why the church is so important, guys. Church is so important because we become witnesses to body. We become witnesses to community. We become witnesses to Christ as we live it out with each other. So here's the deal. I'm going to tell you something. This is so important because people watch. Do you know that? People watch. People watch. People watch. They watch. My daughter, I've told you about, she's like an unpaid staff member at the Villages United Methodist Church over in Nolensville. Was our newest. Is it still our newest United Methodist? Is there one newer than that now? Rapidly growing. My daughter and our son-in-law, they're just active. They volunteer. Sure they don't have a building, meet in the school. They have to set up and take down. They're doing that all the time, volunteering their time, working with youth. They're just doing all kinds of stuff. My daughter's degree is in marketing. She's done free marketing for the church. They're just so active. My son has trouble with the church. You know what his trouble is? He's seen it. He's seen it. Now, he's seen a lot of good, and he'll remember that. There'll be a day, he'll remember that. He'll remember the good. He'll remember the mission work that's been done. He'll remember the lives that have been. He'll remember that. But he's also seen, you know what hangs him up? You know what hangs up my son? Hypocrisy. It's being around people that say, Jesus, 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 and they don't live like Jesus. That's what I get out of the Ten Commandments. Relationship to God, relationship to each other. Those two are so intertwined. And when people see it in us, gee whiz, They want that. When they see the positive, when they see that, man alive, they want that because they know it's life-giving. They know that, and they want that. So that's our calling, to witness to that. Let's come pray about that, will you? Let's pray about that. God bless you. See you next time.